And now we are moving to our next presentation, which is going to be presented by Christos Pliatsikas. And we can be looking forward to hear talk on the effects of bilingualism on brain development from early childhood to young adulthood. Christos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michal. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, should be fine now. So thank you very much. I'm here to present a project looking at brain structure and actually development of brain structure from early childhood to young adulthood. This has been a truly collaborative project. So I work with colleagues here in the UK, Lotte Meteyard, Vincent, Deluca, colleagues in Germany, Joao Verissimo, and colleagues in the States, Kyle Shattuck and Michael Ullman. And this project was funded by the Experimental Psychology Society and the American Philological Society. So most of my work has been on how bilingualism affects brain structure. And we have plenty of evidence nowadays to suggest that, yes, bilinguals do show structural brain alterations compared to monolinguals. And where these alterations are found, it varies a lot. So they can be found in cortical regions or subcortical gray matter structures, but also the white matter tracts that connect these regions. And when I say alterations, most of the times we see more structure, more tissue, especially in the gray matter, but also in the white matter for bilinguals. And it has also been suggested that these increase in tissue might lead to slower decline of the brain in older age, or something that some researchers have called a brain reserve. We're not talking about aging now. I'm just putting this on because it will become relevant in the discussion. In all, bilingualism seems to be on par with other long-term experiences which have been shown to change the structure of the brain while a new skill acquired or a new skill is maintained and applied. For example, we know that there's structural alterations if you learn how to juggle, or if you learn how to use a novel tool, or if you're an expert navigator like a taxi driver in London. We know that specific parts of the brain that underlie those skills change structure in order to accommodate the new skills. And I have to say, there is evidence from all these different types of skills, but there's a lot of evidence when it comes to bilingualism. So what does bilingualism involve? It involves learning an additional language, obviously, on top of a language that you already have. It involves using two languages or processing two languages, but it also involves controlling between two languages, right? All of us that speak more than one language, we know that we have to use one language and then avoid using the other. So you need to control interference from the language that's not your target language at a given context. So perhaps not surprisingly, bilingualism has shown to affect the structure of regions involved in language learning, in language processing and control. So what you see in this picture here, hopefully you can see my mouse, is all these regions that have been reported in different studies to be mostly increased in size for bilinguals versus monolinguals. You will see it's a great collection of structures. So it's easier to say there isn't a lot of stuff at the back of the brain, at the occipital lobe, but more or less all other parts of the brain have been reported in one or the other study. That includes the cortex, that includes structures deep inside the base of the brain, like the basal ganglia, the cerebellum at the back of the brain, but also the white matter tracts that you see here that connect the different regions between them. I say different effects have been reported in different studies, but the reported effects vary a lot by how experienced the bilingual is, right? So you find different effects in simultaneous bilinguals versus sequential bilinguals, active bilinguals versus passive bilinguals, so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into too many details about this because what we care about is how these effects might interact with the developing brain. In other words, what does the structure of the developing brain in bilingual children look like? Before doing this, let's see what we know about brain development in general, in structural terms. Actually, the trajectories of brain development are very, very well, well studied. Sorry. Gray matter, that's the cortical gray matter, the surface of the brain, generally shows decreases between early childhood and early adulthood. Well, actually, not just the cortex, the subcortical structures as well. So we know that we have less and less gray matter as we grow older. There is some variance on how you measure it. There are different ways of measuring gray matter. So you can measure cortical thickness, so how thick it is, surface area, how wide it is, or the actual volume in cubic millimeters. And we know that when it comes to thickness, we have very strong evidence that it decreases continuously. So our cortex gets thinner as we grow older. Other measures, surface area and volume, show nonlinear trajectories with increases up until the end of the first decade, followed by decreases as well. And subcortical volumes, things like the basal ganglia, the thalamus, and also the cerebellum, have more varied patterns. White matter, on the other hand, generally increases from early childhood to early adulthood. And this is measured as increases in different metrics of white matter. So these are measures that show how much white matter or how much myelin we have. And these are fractional anisotropy. So increased fractional anisotropy or decrease in mean diffusivity tell us you have more white matter as you grow up. Still, we don't know the precise nature of this process, and it's very difficult to study in the living brain in vivo. So what about bringing the two topics together, right? So what do we know about bilingualism and brain development? Well, actually, remarkably little. Despite some early suggestions that the effects that we find in bilingual adults, so all these effects that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, they might have the roots in their development. That was suggested as early as 2006. We don't have enough evidence from children or adolescents. I am calling 2006 early because this is where the first studies on the bilingual brain started, the structure of the bilingual brain. So when it comes to white matter, we only have a couple of studies from the same group that showed us that there is increased white matter integrity in simultaneous children compared to sequential bilingual children. But these researchers followed these children for another 3 years of exposure, and they showed that those sequential bilinguals also increased the integrity of the white matter after 3 years of being in an immersive environment, an environment that they had opportunities to practice using of both of their languages. Other people have found thinner frontal and temporal cortex, and at the same time, higher volume in subcortical structures like the putamen for bilingual children with balanced proficiencies when they compared them to those with unbalanced proficiencies. So there was no monolingual comparison group here. Some other people have found greater surface area in the anterior cingulate cortex for adolescent bilinguals only, but not for younger bilinguals. Other studies found no differences in frontal regions like the inferior frontal gyrus between immersed bilingual children and monolingual controls. This is all we have, right? This is less than 10 studies. And these patterns are very limited, but they echo effects found in adults. So if you look at them on an experience-based perspective, you will see that the most experienced bilinguals are the ones that show increases in white matter and also increases in volume of subcortical structures, whereas less experienced bilinguals show mostly increases in frontal and temporal structures. So we know very little, right? And we wanted to make a start in the developing bilingual brain. We start with the hypothesis that if bilingualism has analogous effects on the brain of children and adolescents as it has in adults, we might expect similar effects on gray and white matter in these groups and also in similar structures. But these effects should overlay or somehow interact with the general and well-documented, actually, developmental brain trajectories that apply to everyone. Specifically, for cortical gray matter, and especially for cortical thickness, which is the metric that's better understood compared to the other two, the expected developmental decreases that all children face should interact with bilingualism-induced increases right? We've said that bilingualism increases gray matter volume in specific areas. So in all, this should lead to an overall slower decrease in bilinguals versus monolinguals. So they both age, right? They both grow old. They both lose some tissue, gray matter tissue, but this loss should be slower for bilinguals compared to monolinguals. For subcortical gray matter, and also for white matter, following up what we've seen from more experienced adult bilinguals at least, we would expect increases in gray matter volume or in white matter integrity only at later stages of experience, right? So only in groups that had increased opportunities to use their languages. This sort of research is expensive, and a good way to start looking at these things is going back to previously published brain data. So for this study, we use the PING dataset, Pediatric Imaging, Neurocognition, and Genetics dataset, which provides demographic data and also structural neuroimaging data of 1,493 participants aged between the age of 3 and 21, which is a dream sample if you work in fMRI. After several exclusions, so we only kept typically developing children with no history of any speech and language impediment or neurological issues, so on and so forth. We ended up with 711 participants for the gray matter analysis and 637 participants for the white matter analysis. This was because some participants or some of the centers that participated in this data set included data for both gray matter and white matter, whereas some other centers only included data for the gray matter. So within these samples, we defined bilinguals as native speakers of English with knowledge of at least another language. I have an asterisk here, which should be a huge star or exclamation mark or whatever you want it to be. I know this is not a good definition, but we were limited by what the database would give us. And the database would give us one question, is English your native language? Yes, no. Another question is, do you speak another language than English? Yes, no. So this is all we have in the language background, which is, it's not simply less than ideal, it's not good enough, but at least it's a start. And in this table, I'm showing you how these groups break down into subgroups. So for gray matter, we had 141 bilinguals and 570 monolinguals. For white matter, 127 bilinguals, 510 monolinguals. And I'll also point you out, I mean, I've broken them down by age range, just to show you that we were very weak on the very, very young age range, between 3 to 6, with only 13 bilinguals and 11 for gray matter and 11 for white matter. I'm just pointing these things out because they will become relevant later on. So this is the analysis, and these are the regions that are provided by PING. And PING provides pre-processed measures of brain morphology. So we didn't work with real brains. We worked with files giving us values for brain volume or the other metrics. And in these files, we had 33 cortical gray matter regions. And for each of them, we had measures for thickness, volume, and surface area. Another 8 subcortical gray matter regions and the cerebellum, and we had metrics for volume only. And for white matter tracts, we had 20 tracts with measures for FA, MD, and another 2 metrics, which we won't use now. And all these metrics came twice, separate for each hemisphere. So you understand we're talking about a huge analysis because all of these structures were analyzed in exactly the same way that I will show you. So for this project, we used generalized additive models, GAMS in R. So GAMS is a fairly new technique in the field, and I have to admit I'm still understanding it, but I have my stats gurus on this team, which do all the thinking for me, I suppose. So what GAMS do is they fit nonlinear regression splines. And they allow the detection of nonlinear curves, and they avoid overfitting, right? So they reduce overfitting. So they only report a perfect straight line in any effect you're looking at if there's not enough evidence for the nonlinearity you're looking at. We chose GAMS instead of more traditional linear methods because we thought they would be better suited to curved shapes, such as those nonlinear patterns that we observe in brain development. as you might remember from the beginning, well, things like cortical thickness might generally show a straight line of decline as you grow up, but other measures, thank you, Michal, but other measures have more non-linear patterns. We ran separate GAMs for each structure and each tract and each metric, right? So you remember I said we had 33 cortical measures times 3 and subcortical and white matter. So you do the maths how many analyses we run. So in these models, the same routine was followed each time. So brain metrics were used as the predicted values. And our predictors included age, bilingualism, yes or no, and hemisphere, left and right. We also added things like parental education, income, genetic ancestry, the scanner, the lab that participated, covariates, plus a random smooth for participant. So we used a 3-level approach for this analysis. So at the first level, we ran 4 alternative models per tract and metric with all combinations of bilingualism, yes and no, and all combinations of hemisphere, left and right, as reference level. So this gives us 4 different versions of the same model. And we do that especially because we have unequal groups in bilingualism. And we found that if you change the reference level, you might change the pattern of results. So this included all applicable 2-way and 3-way interactions. And if in this model, the 3-way interaction emerged significant, and if that emerged significant in all 4 models, 4 alternatives, we subsequently analyzed separately by hemisphere. Thank you, Michal. So this only applied to 2 metrics, and I won't talk about this simply because there were no effects of bilingualism. If this interaction was not significant, we collapsed across hemisphere and moved to the second level. In the second level, we ran 2 alternative models with both levels of bilingualism as reference levels, yes and no. If the interaction emerged significant there, then we moved on to the third level, where we looked at the effects of age on each level of bilingualism separately. Quite complex routine. It took us a while to find the best way to approach this data. So these are some results, and you only see a subset of the regions that I showed at the beginning. I'll start by saying that we had a main effect of age for all regions, which makes sense, right? So they had the age expected patterns. No main effect of bilingualism for almost any of these regions. This doesn't matter really because this is just a yes or no factor, but it's averaging across a wide age range between 3 and 21. But the regions that you see here are the ones that gave us significant age by bilingualism interaction. And you see mostly we found that in cortical thickness, for cortical thickness, but also for volume, surface area, and only one white matter tract right at the bottom. At the third level analysis, we found that age was a significant predictor of volume or white matter integrity for all these structures. What does it mean? The interaction that you see means that the effects of age were different. The shape of the effects of age were different for each level of bilingualism. That's why both groups have a significant main effect of age because, well, developmental effects, but what changes, what differs is the shape of these effects. And this will become clearer very soon. So this is a quick overview of the results of the parts of the brain that turned out to be affected. And you see most of them were frontal. Thanks, Michal, I might need 2 minutes, but I'm getting there. Mostly frontal and parietal and some small temporal effects. And I've chosen to show you some graphs of cortical thickness only. So we had a smaller set of results for the for volume and surface area. And you will see here at the bottom, you see the same parts of the brain marked by the, well, they're colored according to the F value. So the darker the region, the bigger the effects. And what I want you to look at is these graphs. So for each of these graphs, in the x-axis, you see the age of the participant, and the y-axis, you see cortical thickness in millimeters. And the blue lines are monolinguals, and the red lines are bilinguals. So a common pattern in all these graphs is that towards adolescence, after late childhood, more or less, in all these regions, the red line is higher than the blue line. So yes, they both decline. We know thickness gets smaller as you grow up, but indeed it seems like thickness is smaller. Oh, sorry, this decline is slower for bilinguals only. And here are all the frontal areas that were affected, and here are all the parietal areas that were affected. The only tract that showed some effects was a tract connecting frontal and subcortical structures that you see here. And again, we saw that towards the end of adolescence, there was an effect of bilingualism. Also note what happens at the beginning. I'll talk about that in a second. So just to summarize what we've seen, well, both groups showed the expected developmental trajectories for all regions, continuous decreases in thickness, non-linear trajectories for the other measures, which I didn't present. Some regions were significantly affected by bilingualism, and we saw overall less gray matter loss with development, especially after late childhood, high matter integrity for the affected tract. And then, as I said, we had some unexpected reductions for bilinguals in early childhood. It wasn't only for the white tract, but it was in the other tracts here in some cases. However, remember, we're talking about only 11 people at this age range, so we are very cautious about what this effect might mean. The effects were largely found in frontal and parietal regions and the white matter that lies beneath them. So the affected regions match those that are reinforced or affected, whatever, by bilingualism, especially less experienced bilinguals. There are several interpretations for the affected regions, several of them for part of the dorsal stream, which underlies things like articulatory functions. So these increases might signify increased competition, articulatory competition in bilinguals. Several of these regions are part of the procedural memory as defined by Michael Ullman's model, and that underlies multiple aspects of language, including grammar. So this again might tell us something about competing of two different grammars, so two different speech sounds representations for bilinguals. And also several of these regions, particularly the frontal ones, are implicated in executive functions. And again, we have talked already, and you heard Mina's talk just before me, how important reliance on executive functions is for bilinguals. That's the last slide. So implications of future study. Yes, it seems like bilinguals and monolinguals differ even during development, and the affected regions correspond to those reported in adults. Might be the case that the brain reserve or the resilience of the bilingual brain in older age begins early during development. We need to have a proper longitudinal study to assess this, obviously. And future research should aim for a cross-sectional or even longitudinal studies, even better, of similar size, but very well described bilingual groups. And that was it, just to thank all my colleagues and collaborators. The paper is now in resubmission, but you can access the preprint here if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christos, for an interesting talk. We have already also a very interesting question which relates your talk to the talk of the keynote speaker we heard before. For those who attended this talk and the keynote speaker's talk, Mina Lehtonen mentioned that in a large review study, there were no consistent results reporting the bilingual advantage, if I wrap it up in this very short way. And we have Mari and Murand asking, how would you interpret these differences with regard to the brain structure, to the no differences in behavioral data, which were mentioned by the keynote speaker before?
Thank you for that. I think I wouldn't attempt to link what has been found in other studies to what has been found in our study, because I have no way of knowing whether these samples are comparable. And that's because I don't have, as I said, I don't have an appropriate linguistic background for the bilinguals in this study. So I am agnostic to this. We're also agnostic to how behavior links to brain structure, not just brain function, but even brain structure. I don't think we have a good idea. What we can do, actually, is look at data from these particular children. And that's a spoiler alert. I am doing that already. So the pink data set provides behavioral data from a series of tasks. And some of these tasks are the classical ones used in the literature. So we have data from a flunkers, we have data from dimensional card sorting test, some other attention tests, which I don't remember now. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at the behavioral effects in the exact same way, whether they change, whether there are any differences or whether they change with age. But also I'm working with one of my MSc students, Alex, I think he's attending, looking at how behavior might be predicted by white matter structure, and also whether this would interact with bilingualism. So there's a lot to be done yet, but it's difficult to compare very different studies.
Thank you for answering this question. We have next one from Michal Paradovsky. Christos, would you say the great white matter findings may have implication for neurodegenerative diseases?
It might as well do. It might as well do. And Michal might be familiar with the literature, which remains very small. But there is all this discussion about how building all this brain reserve might counteract brain decline. And well, when it comes to neurodegenerative diseases, the literature remains even more limited compared to healthy or typical aging. And we are actually working on a review paper on this exact question, how brain reserve that's accumulated by bilingualism counteracts in any way the effects of diseases such as Parkinson's or Huntington's. So there might be implications. We don't know yet. We need a lot of more research on this, but at least we have some very interesting research questions to answer.
Thank you. We have next question is coming from Vincent Boswijk, who's thanking you for the interesting talk. He's wondering whether you can explain the deviations of the smooth and the outer ends of the plots. So it's like the age of acquisition up to 5. Does this mean that the model has difficulty predicting these outer values?
Yes, I know. These effects have puzzled us a lot. So I can go back to the graphs, if that helps the colleague. So yes, in a few of these structures, few of these effects, we find this unexpected inverse effect at the beginning. And we don't know why. We're still thinking about it, but as I said, what is really problematic about this data set is that we only have something like 11 bilinguals, I think, for gray matter up until the age of 5. So we have almost a fifth of what we had for the monolinguals. So these effects are indeed this effect is very, very difficult to interpret. It might be an issue with how GAMs operate. I am not sure. But as I said, it would be good to have an explanation for this, but unfortunately we don't.
Okay, thank you very much. And now the time has come for the last question for this talk. We can conclude this section after your answer, or your talk after your answer. It's from Alexis Hervé Adelman, who's thanking you for the fascinating talk and sharing these exciting analyses. Do you think that these precocious effects could be different in character to those that might occur with later language acquisition?
Yes, thanks Alexis for this. The problem we have with this analysis is that we don't know our bilinguals. So I can tell you that the very early effects, these should be early bilinguals, obviously, because they're too young. But for any other of these effects, we have no idea whether they are simultaneous or early sequential or late sequential or any of those. So I wish we had age of acquisition that we could add as a predictor in this analysis. This would have cleared up this pattern immensely, actually. But I happen to know there is research happening here in London in UCL looking at these things, and they're starting a developmental study we look in the brain structure. So I think we will have more answers very soon.
That sounds